Hey Merfolk fans, I'm Joe. Thanks very much for joining me today. If you'd like to support my channel, please check out the link above to my Patreon page. So I've been testing the list that I posted the deck tech for recently with 4 Benthic Biomancers and 4 Deprive in the main deck. And it's been feeling really wonderful. I've played 4 leagues now, with 3 leagues going 4-1 and 1 league going 5-0. So cumulatively, my results have been 17 wins, 3 losses, which is 85% win rate, which is really kind of absurd. It's not sustainable. I don't think that any deck or any player can sustain an 85% win rate. Even pros tend to float just around like 60% because eventually variance catches up with you, and things even out over the long run. 20 matches is not, the largest sample size. But at the same time, I'm not complaining. I've been enjoying all the wins. It's been feeling wonderful. So just to remind you guys, Benthic Biomancer has really kind of been a catalyst for me to change our approach, sort of make a hard turn towards playing more at instant speed. This guy's ability gives us an excuse to hold up 2 mana more often. We already had Merfolk Trickster, and my idea was to start adding in these main deck 2 blue counter spells, take advantage of all of the islands that we run, and have these really strong hard counters in our main deck so that we can even counter opponents' creatures, Death Shadow, whatever, Knight of the Reliquary. In the past, our counter magic has been something like Spell Pierce, which is always limited to only non-creatures. And so as I mentioned, it's just been running really, really smoothly. Being able to respond to what the opponent does on their turn at instant speed is quite strong, especially if you have sort of a deep understanding of the format and you know what the big threat cards are, when you have to spend a counter spell, when you can sort of pass and just adapt Ben on the opponent's end step. So this video I'm kind of going to discuss how Deprive has felt in the main deck, and whether it might be more appropriate to switch the 4 main deck Deprives over to Wizard's Retort. So, the cards are obviously really similar. Looking at the top of them, there's quite a discrepancy in their mana cost. One is 2 CMC, one is 3 CMC. But Wizard's Retort costs 1 less if we control a wizard. So, sort of a fundamental, theoretical example of how the 2 cards would differ in function is if we play nothing on turn 1 except an island, and then on turn 2 we play a second island and just pass the turn, Deprive would be castable, whereas Wizard's Retort would not be castable yet because we don't have a wizard and we don't have 3 mana. However, our deck has tons of 2-drops, so in a situation like that, we can just go ahead and play a Lord, play a Silvergill, play Spreading Seas. Maybe we drew an extra AEther Vial we can play. We always have early plays. Our deck has a very low curve, and this sort of theoretical example of passing on turn 1 on turn 2 with no creatures on the board and wanting to counter something, it doesn't really come up very often. In practice, you're going to most often want to counter things on turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, when the opponent is starting to want to resolve their big payoff spells, like their big creatures, things like Gifts Ungiven, etc. Not so much on turn 2. So again, Ben has felt great. The instant speed ability has allowed me to play these counter spells. Deprive, it's been in our decks now for probably more than a year, if I had to estimate. We saw M. Hayashi was having excellent results with it in his sideboard, and eventually we all came around and saw that a 2 blue mana hard counter can be quite powerful. However, we just accepted that it was going to bounce a land back to our hand, and that was a cost that we could absorb because we run AEther Vial, and bouncing a land probably not going to be that big of a deal in many situations. However, if we run enough wizards, could Wizard's Retort just be better in, the vast majority of situations, since we'd prefer to keep our lands on the battlefield if possible? Clearly, You know, if we have a Master of Waves in hand and we have a 4th land to play on turn 4, we'd love to be able to just jam Master of Waves in some situations. However, if you cast Deprive and bounce a land back to your hand, now you're going to have to wait till turn 5 at the earliest to get that Master of Waves on the table. So, does our wizard count in the deck potentially justify swapping out the Deprives for Wizard's Retorts? It's a really, really interesting question. Again, the cards are very similar, and the differences and the different situations that can arise are pretty varied and pretty nuanced. But I have been tracking this kind of data as I've been playing these last 20 matches. So before I began considering bringing in these main deck counterspells, there have been some different, some variety of blue-red Wizards lists that have been taking advantage of Wizards Lightning, which has a similar cost reduction effect if you control a wizard, but it's more like a lightning bolt. This is one example of a deck that I guess 5-0'd a competitive league. They're calling it blue-red aggro, but most people would probably refer to it as blue-red wizards. They have 2 Wizards Retorts in the main, obviously less than the 4 counterspells that I've been running in my main deck, but my list is better prepared to pack for, you know, blue-blue counterspells in the main deck because we're running more basic blue sources, and more important, because we're running AEther Vial. Passing a turn with 2 blue up is much easier if you can continue to develop your board by activating AEther Vial and putting creatures onto the battlefield. So the counterspell itself, whether it's Deprive or Wizard's Retort, has really felt amazing, and it's allowed me in many circumstances to win these games that have led to these great results in my leagues. However, I guess going into the testing, I had kind of an unspoken, unwritten hypothesis that there would be some percentage of time, maybe 10% or 20%, where Wizard's Retort would be uncastable when I needed it. For example, imagine you're stuck on 2 blue lands and no other lands, and you have just 2 lords on the battlefield, and the opponent goes to cast something like a Primeval Titan that you really want to counter. Wizard's Retort would be uncastable there because the lords are not wizards, and so they don't reduce the cost of Wizard's Retort, and we don't have 3 mana to pay for it. So yeah, again, I expected there to be maybe 10% or 20% of instances where Wizard's Retort would be unusable, and thus justify running Deprive in the main deck instead, with a Wizard's Retort as like a backup in the sideboard. But in testing, there were literally zero situations where I needed to counter something, and I neither had a wizard or 3 mana. You know, if you have 3 extra mana open or have a wizard, then Wizard's Retort is always just better than Deprive, because it, again, doesn't make you bounce a land back to your hand like Deprive does. So not a single instance where Wizard's Retort wouldn't have just been better than Deprive. So you can see in the list here, I've moved the Wizard's Retorts into the main, and just moved the Deprives into the sideboard. It's kind of just swapping positions. Instead of 4 Deprive and 2 Wizard's Retorts, now I've got 4 Wizard's Retorts and 2 Deprive. With the data that I collected, it seemed sort of unjustifiable to prefer Deprive over Wizard's Retort. Again, AEther Vial makes these counterspells extra amazing in Merfolk decks, on top of Ben allowing us to hold up the 2 blue. But beyond that, you know, I do have 19 wizards, whereas if we look again at that Wizards list before, only had 16. So Wizard's Retort fits really, really well in this deck. If I can touch on a couple other small adjustments I made after my 3rd league. I took out the 3 surgical extractions from the sideboard because I wasn't seeing as many graveyard decks as I expected. Hardened Scale Affinity, though, I did run into twice. The first time I got sort of steamrolled, and I felt I wasn't comfortable with just being totally unprepared for that matchup. So since I had some extra sideboard slots, I threw back in a couple of our old favorite Hurkyl's Recall, and a single Dismember, which is good against, obviously, a wide variety of decks, including like Storm, if you want to kill their cost-reducing creatures, or something like a Tireless Tracker, which can bury us in card advantage. Dismember is just a good, very versatile spell. And then I trimmed 1 Mutavault in the main deck because there were just a small handful of games where Mutavault made it very difficult for me to actually cast my counter spells, cast my creatures. So yeah, I'm going to go with 2 Mutavaults for a little while and see how it goes. You know, some of the blue-green lists actually run 0 Mutavaults, so there's definitely sort of a range of acceptable Mutavault density that, and you know, where you can still win with 0 Mutavaults. You should still probably be able to win with 2 Mutavaults. So the last league that I ran, I went 4-1, and it was with this exact list with the 2 Mutavaults. And yeah, it felt really smooth. So what I'd like to do now is give you guys a few examples of actual sort of situations I encountered in my testing over these last 20 matches to just explain a little bit about the sort of practical theory of how this list works. There's a notion that's really important to understand beyond just the wizard density when assessing whether Wizard's Retort is going to be sort of workable or not. And it's the idea of sequencing. In Merfolk, the only non-wizards are the lords. All the other creatures, in my case, I've got, I think it's 19 wizards, all the non-lords are wizards. So I've got 19 of them in my deck. And those are the creatures that we play on turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. The lords don't come out until the end of the game when we're ready to alpha strike, when we've got Island Walk established. So if we have any creatures at all on the battlefield, they're virtually always going to be wizards. As in this first example, where I opened turn 1 with Ben. Turn 2, I played an island and passed back to the opponent. Now, this player is on Grixis Death Shadow. They've got 4 cards in the graveyard already. They're at 14 life. You can see they took an Echoing Truth out of my hand on turn 1 with a Thoughtseize. So they could very easily just play a land, play a Gurmag Angler, play a Tassiger, play a Death Shadow, play 2 Death Shadows. And having access to counter magic in this particular situation is quite strong. However, you can see I already control a wizard, since, as I mentioned, we sequence our wizards up front. And if the opponent plays, goes for the Gurmag Angler, we can counter it and then continue just to apply pressure. Grixis Death Shadow hits their life total really hard, really early, and try to stick a big threat. If we can prevent that threat from sticking, then they have no blockers to resist our attacks. So going on to like a second example here, this is against blue-white control. Obviously, I don't have the strongest hand in the world. The Silvergill and the Mutavault are just doing their best. But again, with the idea of creature sequencing, our wizards come down first. So I've got a Silvergill Adept down there. And as with the example with Ben previously, Wizard's Retort is just going to be better in these situations because we control a wizard early in the game. In this situation, if I didn't control a wizard, if I didn't have Ben in my hand, then on my turn, I could have just easily played Spreading Seas. We're often, if not virtually always, going to have some 2-drop we could play. If push came to shove, I could even play Harbinger just to get some aggression going on the board. Going back to the blue-white example, here I was able to play a Silvergill Adept and then pass the turn with 2 mana up. If the opponent goes for Teferi, I can counter it, untap, and just start attacking. So this is another example where Wizard's Retort would be better because we can just skip bouncing a land. Clearly, in this situation, bouncing a land, not the biggest drawback, but if you don't have to set yourself back on tempo, you'd rather not. Moving on to the next example, you can see I've got a couple of AEther Vials here against Burn. This is just on the beginning of the opponent's 3rd turn. They're clearly going to attack with Eidolon. That's what they do. And we're going to flash in Trickster. Since I think in this spot we're trying to build up devotion for Master of Waves, we'd probably prefer not to trade off our Trickster to keep him on the board for devotion. So I think we're probably going to want to tap the Eidolon down at the beginning of combat. Also, the Eidolon is actually better for us here because it's better on the board because we have AEther Vials. We don't have to actually play spells. We can just cheat things in with AEther Vial. So the opponent is going to have to take damage with their Eidolon on the board as they continue to cast spells throughout the game. So I'm going to flash in Trickster at the start of combat, tap down the Eidolon, and then in the second main phase, the opponent went for Searing Blaze on Merfolk Trickster. Now I have the Deprive in hand, but this is another example where Wizard's Retort would just be better because, again with sequencing, our Tricksters, our Harbingers, our Silvergills, our Bens, they all come onto the table first. These are the guys who lead the charge, and if we need to counter something in the early game, we're going to be pretty likely to be able to do it because we'll always have a wizard on the table. Well, virtually always. So in this situation, I was able to counter the Searing Blaze with Deprive, but we would also be able to do it with Wizard's Retort without having to bounce one of our lands. Again, you can see the drawback of Deprive really not that big here because we're going to play this game through AEther Vial almost exclusively. Our land count doesn't really matter, and effectively, if I bounce the land and don't draw another land, then it doesn't matter at all because I literally would only have 2 lands on the next turn anyway. So looking at another example against Burn, this is a spot where I don't have a wizard on the table, and so Wizard's Retort is going to be uncastable this turn, but I've got another option with Merfolk Trickster in my hand that can come in at instant speed and tap down this Monastery Swiftspear and so prevent some damage from the Burn player. If I didn't have the Trickster here, I would have just been able to play a Lord, at sorcery speed on my turn, which is what Merfolk decks have been doing forever, right? I mean, you can't really call that a bad play, just running out a Lord. It's something we've been doing since the Merfolk deck was created. Now, however, we're trying to operate on the opponent's turn, and even though Wizard's Retort would not be an option here, Trickster is. I'm going to be able to tap down this Swiftspear, keep ticking up my AEther Vial, and I'll play a third land, at which point I'll be able to open up my game more and more. But it's just to show that when we don't have Wizard's Retort online, we'll always have something else to do with our mana. So here's an example against Hardened Scales Affinity, where again we don't have a wizard on the table yet on turn 2, but we have a Wizard's Retort in hand. So we can't pass the turn and hope to counter the opponent's Steel Overseer, or maybe they'll go ahead and play out a Walking Ballista, even though it'd be pretty poor right now just as a 1/1. We won't be able to counter any of those spells, but I think the correct play here anyway, in these kinds of aggressive matchups, is just to develop our board. We're not going to need our counterspell until a little later in the game, where they have more mana on the table, when they have a Hardened Scales resolved. Then they try to resolve something like a Walking Ballista, or maybe an Arcbound Ravager, or some sideboard spell like a Dismember to kill one of our lords or to kill Master of Waves. So here, the correct play is just to jam a lord. So even though we don't control a wizard, even though Wizard's Retort is technically uncastable as if we pass the turn, a typical Merfolk development is just going to want us to tap out on turn 2 many times anyway. So you can't really consider these situations kind of negatively when assessing Wizard's Retort. So I hope all of those examples have kind of explained why in this particular list, with 19 wizards, with AEther Vial, with our particular line of sequencing, our preferred sequencing, Wizard's Retort is actually quite a good fit and a very, very powerful card for our deck. So I think that just about wraps up this video. I just wanted to share my thoughts in the testing that I've been doing over the last few days. Just to say again, the list has felt more powerful than any Merfolk list I've ever played. And I've been playing for a long time. I've been making videos for a long time. So hopefully this encourages many of you to try a similar approach with your play. I think you guys should all be playing Benthic Biomancer. Through the first 3 leagues, I tracked very closely what Ben was doing, when he was looting, when he was adapting, whether he was getting in for 2 damage very often or not. And he just overperformed so often that in the 4th league, I just stopped tracking data for him. Like, he is just absolutely a mainstay in the deck. I can say for myself, I've been more excited playing with the new edition of Ben than I was with the new edition of Trickster. And I was extremely excited when Merfolk Trickster came into the deck. And, obviously Trickster and Ben make each other better because they're both sort of instant speed enablers. And I'm thrilled to have both of them in the deck. But I'm just more excited about Ben. I've been wanting a Merfolk 1-drop forever, and I don't think I would have ever predicted that it would have taken this precise shape with this weird 2-mana ability that loots and grows the creature. But, Wizards, they're pretty creative. Wizards of the Coast, that is. And they knocked it out of the park with this one. So for those of you who are still on the fence about whether Ben seems good or not, I think he's definitely actually better than a blue Merfolk Thraben Inspector would be, as I predicted, because he often hits as a 2/2, which can close out games. I had a game against blue-white control where I won with Xaxes after swinging with Ben and some other creatures a few times, but Ben was a 2/2. So if he had been any other Merfolk 1-drop as a 1/1, I would have been 2 or 3 damage short, and the opponent could have then untapped and cast Terminus, or untapped and cast Teferi, or Snapcaster Path. They would have had more chances to disrupt my plan. But because Ben was so big, and because he helped loot me into the cards that I needed, he just closed out the game a turn earlier, which, it's just amazing. You don't expect our 1-drops to be this powerful, and he just has been consistently. So, yeah, I think I've said enough about it. Please leave your thoughts down below. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my Patreon page if you want to support the channel. And yeah, tune in for the next video where I'll be back with some replays of these leagues that I've been playing, since I think you guys would enjoy them. So I will see you there. Bye-bye.